Everyone, and welcome to Lanteria's webinar today with me, Kelly Tucker, and my guest, Andrew. We are talking today about ending employee relations gracefully. So how do we take a people-centric approach when, unfortunately, we have to look at making people redundant within our business? And I think we're all sort of in that area, people management or business owners, business leaders who, will unfortunately at times have to find ourselves in this situation. So we're just going to today look at that in terms of the reasons why, how we should be handling it, and the way that we can ensure that when we do have to go through this situation, that we do it with a people-centric approach. So I'm just going to intro myself before I hand over to Andrew. So those of you who've not seen me on a Lanteria webinar before, I'm Kelly Tucker. I'm the Managing Director of HR Star. We're a HR consultancy based in the UK, and we provide HR support to businesses of varying shape, size, industry, helping on all areas of the employee life cycle. So we take a really involved approach with our clients to ensure that we are creating and maintaining engaged teams. And that exit part of the employee life cycle is just as important as the attract and induction part of it, because when people leave our business, and they will for various reasons, we want to make sure that they're doing that in a as positive way as possible, because of the impact it has on those that are left behind, but also on them as individuals, and also on your business and its reputation. So as I say, we look after all areas of the employee life cycle, but today we'll be focusing on the exit part of it. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Kelly. I was really excited that you actually wanted me to join you on this, because I've been an entrepreneur for like 12 years. I think I've only quit at one job, but obviously I've been part of a lot of like firings and things like that. But for me, it never gets easier, and it's always like one of the most. It's not the hardest part of starting and running a company. So for me, I was really glad that you gave me the chance to at least ask you questions and kind of participate in this and learn a little bit more from you, because it's one of those things that you're never an expert in this. You're always trying to learn how to be better and learn from sort of the last experience you have.
Yeah.
So we prepared I prepared a couple questions. The first one would be, which companies have you seen that have made large number, that their workforce is very redundant right now? Are there any specific industries that have been most affected recently by this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of when we think looking at now redundancies or businesses affected by this and downsizing, etc., it's happening in across the board, but it's definitely, I would say, more larger scale in tech companies. So we're seeing the likes of Microsoft, Twitter, Meta, Amazon, making mass redundancies. And I'm talking, Amazon 18,000 people, Microsoft 10,000. Like, these are big numbers. Obviously, remember they employ massive workforces as well. So as a percentage, I don't have that stat, but it's still, that's affecting a lot of people. So I'd say tech is definitely sort of being really affected by this at the moment.
Yeah, I actually I had a call. I have a good friend of mine that used to work at Spotify, and he left on his own recently. But he was meeting with some of his former colleagues at Spotify, and I don't know how many they laid off, but it was thousands and thousands. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he was there when they were hiring. They were like a 3,000 person company, and they became a 6,000 person company. So he saw a lot of this experience of growth. And he said that a lot of their hiring was just, they hired people because they didn't want the competition to have them. He said, like, we didn't want Netflix to hire this guy, so we hired him, and he was just there. And they probably got paid a fortune just to be there. And so, yeah, tech was, I mean, I'm sure there still are some people in the ranks of many of these tech companies, but it's definitely an area where just capital was so cheap that people were making these hires just to avoid going to another competitor for so long. So what do you see driving some of these numbers of redundancies? Like, what was the biggest driver over the past few years, or even like when did this start? And obviously we know when it came to a head, like the last 6 months, but like what's been the trend here?
I think, and it's interesting what you just said there about obviously, these big tech companies hiring people so that the competitors wouldn't. And I think there's, it's been a bit of a perfect storm, I suppose, if you will, in terms of pre-COVID, especially in the tech industry. But obviously, we're seeing the increase of reliance on tech and social media advertising, etc. It was growing, at a great rate. And then obviously the COVID hit, pandemic sort of turned everything upside down. But I suppose tech was something that benefited during that time for many reasons. Amazon, like everyone is like, let's just order it from Amazon if you can't get it anywhere else. Yeah. And people obviously relying on tech more to work remotely, home setup, for working, etc. And then I think when we started coming out of the pandemic and businesses started to boom again, when we had the war for talent. So again, it's like, well, I'm going to hire these people because I don't want anybody else to, but I do obviously have an increase in demand. So all of this started happening, and then they were paying, over the odds in terms of salary to bring people in because they wanted the best people. Businesses were booming. And then I think, we look at what's happened more recently with the, I suppose, slowed growth in tech due to the looming recession, that the cost of living crisis, the impact of the war in Ukraine slowing down supply chains, and just impact there. And all of these things have come along, and that boom that we saw as we were going in and out of the pandemic is kind of gone. And so now these companies have lesser demand and have all these people, and it's like, oh, I don't actually need these people now. And actually, a lot of these people are costing me a lot of money because I paid over the odds for them because I needed to hire them, or I hired them just because I didn't want my competition to. So I've definitely got more people than I actually need. And so you add all these things together, and it's just like, oh, wow, now I'm going to have to lay off a large percentage of my workforce. And that's why we're seeing such big percentages of people being made redundant, because of the rate that these companies hired at, previously in the last couple of years. So there are a number of things driving this. And I think, it starts with COVID, and then it just leads into the cost of living crisis, the potential recession, the war, the slowed growth. And then you're suddenly in a situation, like I said, where, I'm going to have to now reshape my business to fit actually with, the demand and what I can afford to hire.
Yeah. Do you think, I work in tech, so I'm pretty familiar with this area, but do you think anything around what has happened with Twitter was a catalyst for some of this? That gave them coverage to fire. It happened relatively short after Elon Musk was firing all these people from Twitter. Did you hear any people, at least, even you're in the UK, obviously the US, the UK have similar types of markets, but have you seen that as being a catalyst to a lot of these firings, that it kind of came from this? People were like, well, if he can do it, then we can kind of use that as an excuse.
I think so. And I think that maybe if, there are businesses who are thinking of making mass layoffs anyway, then they've used what's happened at Twitter to kind of be, well, that's obviously not how you should do. I need to do it, so I'll do it, in the right way, and I'll just highlight how we're a great, employer or a great company, because if we're going to do it, we're not going to do it the Elon Musk way. We're going to do it the proper way and look after our people and do it with a bit of empathy. So, but I think as well, there's exactly that. You start to see these big names laying off big numbers, and then you start to think, well, it's probably expected now that it's going to have a domino effect. So I think if people were thinking about it, and I think what we probably have seen as well, when we were in the midst of the pandemic, there were probably many businesses out there who didn't want to do layoffs because they're like, God, what with everything that's going on, I can't now lay off my staff at the same time. So I'll just kind of get through it and see where we are at the other side. And now with the impact of cost of living, etc., and kind of being out the other side, thinking, right, now I feel like I'm in a position I can make those changes. I do now need to lay off those people. But let's be honest, who knew how long the pandemic was going to last? Who knew what the ongoing effects were going to be? We were all just finding our way through it for a long time. So I think a lot of decisions were delayed, and now we're seeing them being implemented.
Yeah, I see. I work more in finance. I work in tech, but in finance as well. And so I see a lot of the correlations to, you see interest rates rising, and you just look at some of these companies as companies like Google aren't affected by this because they took out debt during the pandemic for almost 0%, and it was fixed. So they were getting free money that they're continuing to pay off. But a lot of these companies that have anything fixed to an interest rate, I mean, their interest payments are up 4 to 6x, and that takes out a huge portion of your workforce when you're spending that money on interest payments. So,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things about redundancies is the people part. Like, you think of when you read these titles or the headlines, like people are fired, there's thousands of people going out. What is the impact actually on like the business, like the functioning business and the ongoing day-to-day business of the company?
I think, you know, what you just said is really important, isn't it? Because I think we always have to remember most businesses aren't going to just start laying off like huge amounts of their workforce unless they really have to. You'd like to think that decision has not been made lightly. It's one that they've had to make because, like you say, you know, their cost of running their businesses has massively rocketed. So they have to, like, you know, cut their cloth accordingly. So I think there's always obviously going to have impact on the business, because I'm sure they're trying to balance that with a lot of other things, like, you know, cash flow, or, you know, a decrease in sales maybe, etc. So, you know, the impact on business is they then will have to look at, okay, what about the people who are left behind? Because there's a thing called survivor's guilt. They'll be thinking, oh God, is it just a matter of time before I'm next? So you people in terms of how you're making sure that we can still keep them engaged and they still got trust in the business. I think a lot of that will then come from how they see you handle those redundancies. So if they see, right, you know, you've done that really compassionately, you've been really open and honest, you know, the process has been handled really well, then they're more likely to still trust in you as an employer, which is obviously really important when it comes to staying engaged with the business. But, you know, again, just from the people structures, if you're stripping out loads of people, you're then going to have to be like redefining the structure, people's job roles need to change, much to redefine someone's role, and maybe retraining. So it needs to be seen as part of a bigger process in that, you know, people planning aspect of how do you then change those internal structures to fit what you need to in terms of to meet, you know, demand, cash flow, etc. So it's part of a bigger impact on business. And I think the important part of any redundancy situation, whether you're doing it for a couple or a huge amount, is the planning bit beforehand, like planning it really well before you actually press the button to be like, right, now we're doing it.
How does that get planned? Like, what is, I don't know if you have experience of actually doing this. I don't. But what is the actual process? Because, I mean, there's obviously the life cycle of like, we need to hire fast. We need to hire as many people as we can. And then there has to be sort of a moment where the HR department's like, wait a second. How many months ahead do they see this coming, and what is the actual process of finding these redundancies and then like fixing it, I guess?
Yeah, good question. So I think, yeah, you would always obviously want it as much notice as possible. You should be always looking at those things. So something I do with my clients is workforce planning. So we're always looking at ensuring our people plans are aligned to those business goals. So the moment we see that we're not hitting those goals, whether they be like financial or like numbers, headcount, etc., we'd be looking at, okay, where are we having to like make changes to adapt to that? And then, you know, it could be if you lose a big contract, or, you know, you win the business that you thought you were going to, you said, right, we're just going to have too many people or too much of an overhead than we're going to be able to run with. And I think you always have to remember a redundancy situation. It's the role, not the person you make redundant. So you have to then start looking at, okay, so what roles do I need? And, you know, potentially there'll be roles that I don't need to need anymore, but for certain, you know, for certain reasons. For instance, if you have certain people work on a project and you don't have that project anymore, you might not need those people. Or it's because I just need to reduce numbers. So I have certain teams of, you know, engineers or, you know, whatever, software developers, and I need to reduce the number I've had. So how you plan it and how you implement it and roll it out will very much depend on the business case and how many redundancies you're making and whether you have to pool people. Because if you've got, say, for instance, 20 software developers and you actually need 10, you can't just go in there and say, well, I think I'm going to pick you, and you to stay, and the rest of you, sorry, you're gone. So you have to go through a selection process. And then the fairest way to do that is through using a scoring matrix. So we'll look at things like absence records, performance, whether it's like obviously objectives achieved, goals achieved, etc. in the year, how if you've got performance ratings in your business, how they've rated in their performance reviews, the skills and experience they have, and then you go through a scoring process and obviously, you know, selection. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, so please don't anyone just go off and just start doing that without obviously more detail. But
so
yes,
I mean, it's super important to have the data. I mean, you have to have the data prepared for something like this to be able to actively do this. Like it's
you need a business case, so you need to have a really case of why you're considering making these changes to structure and therefore making redundancies. And when you start the process, and again, it depends on how many people you have regarding how long you have to consult with them, you have to go through consultation with your people. So they have to be informed that their role is at risk and the reasons why, and they get a copy of the business case. And then you enter into a consultation period. So as I said, if it's like individual less than 20 people, it's a reasonable amount of time, which you can define for consultation. And then as you get into bigger numbers, it's a longer consultation process. And then during that time, they can put forward any proposals they have for ways that they feel that redundancy can be avoided or they can be retained within the business. They can apply for any suitable alternatives. You need to consider suitable alternatives for them. And then you meet in and check in through them during that consultation. And then it's if you get to the end of that and the redundancy goes ahead and there's been no way to retain them, then obviously that's when the redundancy is confirmed. And then again, depending on age, length of service, salary, and your redundancy policies will depend on then the redundancy pay they receive, notice period, etc. So it is a lengthy process, which is why I said, you know, the planning part of it is so important, from how you're communicating it, who you're communicating it to, when, how long you're going to consult with them for, do you have suitable alternatives to them, are you using scoring, how are you going through that process?
How does that work? So like, what might be the timeline of something like this, from like when HR decides or management and HR decides, okay, we have too many redundancies, let's start this process, but then like actually communicating this to, honestly, I've never heard this, like the communicate to them previously to say like, hey, you might be part of this redundancy plan. How much time do you give a person? What is like, how often does that actually work out in those cases? That seems like you're kind of like announcing the death before it happens.
I know, right? Yeah.
But
so
how often does it actually work?
So I've handled many redundancies because obviously I've worked in HR now for over 20 years. So, you know, I have handled many of them. I've only a couple of times seen a situation where we've been able to find a suitable alternative and therefore retain somebody within the business and avoid a redundancy. Right. Yeah, unfortunately, more often than not, the redundancy goes ahead. And that might not be the same for everyone's experience. Also, that's my personal experience. But I think it's because you don't tend to, as a business owner, suddenly just make a decision going to make redundancies. A lot of that planning and prep and looking at alternatives has gone in beforehand. And so when you're at the stage where you've got this business proposal, business case for a potential redundancy situation, a lot of prep and thought has already gone into it. But, it might be that once if I speak to you and say, oh, your role is at risk, Andrew. So you might, though, have other things that you've been working on that you think, well, actually, you can retain me in the business by doing this, or there's a role over there that actually I feel like I'll be really good at. I want to apply for that role. So, the individual can always bring something to the table that might not have been considered before. And obviously that's what the consultation period is for. But yeah, so it can last anything from sort of like 2 to 3 weeks to weeks and weeks, depending again how many numbers you are and how long. If they come up with proposals, then you've got to obviously review the proposals, see if there's something you can be implemented. If not, go back and explain why not. You could put trials in place for any proposals that they come up with to see if they could work. So someone might come up. So a recent situation I handled, we were doing a reducing headcount. So there's a number of the same people in the role, and 2 of them said, but we actually would be quite happy to go part-time and do a job share. So like, right, okay, so that's something we considered, and we did implement that. So that's where it worked out, to be fair. It was another where it did work out. So yeah, it's not something you can just rush through, not if you want to do it properly.
How does it work with, I'm always amazed with some of there's obviously like the big companies, but there are also companies that are medium-sized that you'll look at their career pages and they're actively hiring while going through these reduction periods. How, from an HR perspective, do they approach that? Because obviously there's certain like specific roles, like, no, we really do need this person, but this person's also redundant. How do they approach that? Because from like internally, I assume the team's like, well, I really like this team member or this group of team members. You're going to hire new people. I have to onboard them, and at the same time, you're firing these people. How do companies approach that?
I think the best way is with honesty. So I'm a massive advocate for like communication and communicating with your people, because I think if you share with them and can be as transparent as possible of why you're doing what you're doing, and then you can sort of bring them on that journey with you and get them to understand, then they're more likely to engage with it and not
Okay.
feel like, aggrieved by it. But I suppose it depends on the reason. So if, for instance, my example, if we are looking at making redundancy because we don't need any more software developers, but we've had a boom in another area of the business, and so therefore we need to hire there. If nobody in this area of the business where we're making redundancy has the skill set or the experience to be able to like fill the roles that we have vacancies, we have no choice but to go out and hire. But if you're making a role redundant, it's because obviously there is no need for that role anymore. So you definitely should be hiring into that role. So I think it's, again, if you can justify, and if there's a clear reason why you're doing that, communicate and tell your people, say to your people, we're about to go into consultation with X number of employees in this area of the business because for XYZ reasons, we now don't have a need for this role. However, the business is still hiring in this area of the business for XYZ reasons. We would love it if any of these people can be retained within the business, but it will obviously come down to whether they have the skill and ability to fill these roles that we have vacancies for.
How often does this? I know this happen. I've seen this happen in Europe a few times, where I guess more expensive resources or more expensive people in the business kind of get eliminated to bring in more junior people into the business. How often have you seen that happen, and what is usually how do companies approach that? Because I understand you might do it from a management perspective, saying, okay, our overhead's too high, but we still kind of need certain roles here. But how do you approach that type of redundancy where you say, we just have, we could do this for 3 times less, especially now with offshoring and remote work. We've done a few webinars on remote work and all like liquid workforces. So there's so many things at play here that in Western countries, there's this push and pull that I see a lot of companies going through. How are companies approaching this? Like knowing that a lot of people are going to stay on because you're not going to replace everyone, but you might say, hey, I'm going to replace these 30 people with, 30 people in India or in South America or something like that. How are companies communicating this right now?
I think, again, I think it needs to be like, honestly, I think they need to be communicating, honestly, to really, and to explain the reasons why they're doing it. And if it is because they want to reduce overheads or costs, etc., okay, that's a business reason. But I think as a business leader, business owner, you need to be really careful about what are you going to then be doing with those savings? If it's to invest back into your core teams, because we actually want to invest in you guys and we want to give you more opportunity for progression through development, or we want to look at your rewards and benefits packages and enhance those for you, then obviously the workforce will be like, brilliant, I can understand. So you're, reducing the workforce to make savings to then invest back into us. Brilliant. But obviously if a business says, oh, we're going to reduce our overhead so we've got more money, and then they, don't reinvest it back into the workforce, they're going to be like, okay, so why are you doing that? And so again, I think it's just making sure that you're looking at your reasons why, but also again taking that people and ethical approach to say, okay, if we are making some savings, let's be investing some of that back into our people, because otherwise if we don't, they won't be engaged, they won't stay, and then we're just going to be obviously in a situation where we've got to go out and hire new people. So I think, it's about looking at what you're using those cost savings for.
So is this, obviously this is a trend that we're seeing now. Do you see this trend continuing through this year? Do you see it continuing through next year? Like what's the long-term vision of this?
I think what we're hearing now is that the recession, this pending recession isn't going to be as bad maybe, or as long as we thought. So I think possibly this trend could slow, because I think as well, like tech is obviously going to always and continue to have a place, and more so. But I think all of these things are cyclical, to be honest. I think this ongoing, like the trend that we see of businesses thriving and therefore hiring, and then we get into the war of talent, so people pay over the odds for people or hire people so the competition can't, and then we find that that stuff adjusts, and then they have to you let people go. I think that will always happen, to be honest.
It's cyclical.
It is. Yeah, I think it is. I think for now, I think we'll probably possibly see more redundancies this year. And I think if we do see that, it'll be over the next sort of 3 to 6 months. But I think it will slow. And I think as, you know, we settle down, as we come out of the potential recession or cost of living crisis, we'll see a boom again. But yeah, I think it will definitely just continue to be cyclical.
Have you seen, are there any markets that you've seen that are sort of in the opposite end of this cycle right now? That, I mean, clients of yours or people that have reached out where, I mean, obviously tech is sort of on the downturn. I don't know, I suppose oil and gas is probably in the uptick or some sort of things like that. Are you seeing any industries that are like hitting boom times right now, even as things go down?
Yeah, like a couple of our clients are, one is in the hospitality space in terms of luxury staycations. So of course
Okay.
they boomed as people stopped being able to travel abroad, and they
Yeah.
just continue to see that boom where people are still thinking, actually, I'm quite happy to stay at home. Obviously, cost of going on holiday, flying, etc., really, you know, expensive.
Yeah,
So
it's
they're
gone up.
still booming. And another one of ours, this, so I suppose tech, but like smaller tech who can be, you know, I just like, so we've got a client, and they make they design animation for video games and film,
Okay. Yeah.
etc. So they were originally losing staff to some of these big players, because then the staff would go to these big players, and they didn't necessarily invest in these people as much because they could hire on brand, and the fact they could just throw money at these people, and money's a hygiene factor, and it will motivate and engage someone for so long, but eventually they
Yeah.
want a sense of belonging, etc., etc. So what's happening is now these big companies are like making layoffs. They are being able to scoop up these great people, and their businesses are doing really well because they don't have the same overheads, etc. So we work with a lot of creatives, and
Okay.
definitely those sort of medium-sized creators I'm seeing coming out the other side and actually really do it. And they are really spending time and resources and investing now in doing the stuff that we do at HR Star, through really trying to ensure they've got really good employee experience, so that they attract and retain really good staff and good people. So yeah, they're on the other side of it in terms of they are doing really well, and they're making that investment to ensure that they continue to do that through their people. So yeah, we are seeing both sides of the coin, I suppose.
Interesting. It's interesting. It's coming even from tech that some of these smaller companies.
Mm,
I know what you mean. Yeah. And I mean, there are certain areas of tech, pockets of tech that are that are booming right now, especially
mm,
AI or anything around video
yeah,
games, entertainment, things like that. It's
yeah.
it's it's pretty crazy. So you mentioned a couple times, communication, honesty.
Mm,
I guess that's always like a tenet in any sort of HR situation or any management situation in general. Always comes down to this. What is what can we do like as leaders? I mean, like I lead our company, leaders, managers to sort of ensure that we're taking like a people-led approach
mm,
to these redundancies
mhm.
or these redundancy situations.
Yeah. So as obviously you mentioned there, and I've touched on quite a few times, I always think honesty, like communicate as much as you can. Even if you feel like you're in the process where there's nothing to communicate, say that to people. Like, we're still in this part of the process. There isn't any updates at the time, but as soon as we have anything, we'll let you know. Um, and I think as well, it's remembering those people who are not being made redundant, who are then left behind, because you'll need to re-engage
Yeah.
them. They're going to feel the impact and the effects of it as well. And I think with all of this is compassion. It's remembering there is a process, like with redundancy, like with handling grievances, disciplinaries, hiring, etc. There's a process. And I think it's really important you follow a process, but I think it's also, or more important, to remember these people are people and they're humans, and how one person deals with going through the process is going to be very different to how somebody else might, and everyone's situation is different. So what we do when we work with our clients at HR Star is, like, we'll look at process, or we'll look at how we manage different parts of the employee life cycle. But then I think we always have to look at like the moments that matter, and how they matter to different employees. So looking at it through different like people lenses. So, you know, if I'm somebody going through this process, and I live at home with my parents, I don't really have any overheads, and I've got like really transferable skills, and I hadn't been at the company very long, so I didn't really have great, I didn't really bond really with anyone, didn't have a long-term sort of role there. this will impact me, of course, but I'm going to think, well, I'm just going to go and get another job. I'll be okay. Whereas obviously somebody who's been in the company for a very long time is really fearful about going out and potentially finding a new job, hasn't sat an interview for ages, doesn't have an up-to-date CV anymore, has got a family to feed at home. They're going to be impacted and, more so by this. So I think it's always remembering to look at your people and remember that these are people in a process. So be compassionate, listen to your people, ask them, what they need and want, and see if you can, give them that support during the process. One thing I did see through when I was sort of like prepping for today, that some of these big companies who are making large scale redundancies have enhanced like the redundancy pay, etc., where they can just obviously help the people out. So if there's things that you can do, or offering out placement where you bring somebody in to help you see that with their CV writing and how to apply for jobs and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just about being a human being.
So you brought up an interesting point there on when you're dealing with, you mentioned kind of scorecards and looking at like the different sort of KPIs that might go into hiring and firing. How much is it impacted by this person's been here for a long time? There could be a lot of fallout internally from all this. Sorry, my kids just got home. Oh, wow, hang on. So there's a lot of fallout that can come from, people giving backlash and creating these issues going forward versus the person that's just been there for 3 months.
Yeah.
How much of that plays into it? Because you also want to make sure you have the best people going forward, not just the people who've been there historically. Mm-hmm. So how much do you look at that as a manager? Like one thing versus the other when you're building out these scorecards and putting importance there?
Yeah, that's why I think you have to make sure you've got, I always like say to not use obviously, last in, first out, because you may be then, letting go some great talent. And just because somebody's been in the business for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that they are adding as much value as somebody who's been there less amount of time, which is why when we're managing like the employee experience and and all your people within your business, that you need to be looking at, for me, don't just look at engagement data on its own, look at retention with it, and look at feedback from obviously surveys, look at feedback from exit surveys, stay interviews, etc. So when we're looking at scoring, let's not just take, one thing, so like length of service, not at all, because that isn't really telling us anything. So I don't really like to include that. It's looking at, okay, let's look at performance. Let's look at, are they meeting their, and hitting KPIs or their goals, targets, whatever we're setting them. How has their performance reviews been? Are they flexible? Are they adaptable? I think, and it's looking at, all of those things that adds value and that you value within your business. If you've got company values, let's look at, are they aligned to the company guys? Are they, adding there? So I think it's about understanding what's important to you as a business. What do we value? What do we need? And basing your scoring around that.
What is like in your experience, what's like an international truth of how to do this? Like if you said like, there's like one tip I'm going to give you, and it would be, you have to do it fast, or you have to make sure that you like, what would be the one thing you'd say, if you're going to do this, you have to make sure to follow this rule?
Preparation is everything in this for me. Preparation in this is, prepare, be really, really clear on your business reasons, the process you're going to follow, how you're going to roll it out, who's being communicated who and when, what your timescales are, what the next steps in the process are. Just plan, have it totally mapped out so that when you hit the button, you're just going through this process, but obviously with the human element. But yeah.
And how do you keep like how do you decide who knows and who doesn't know in the group?
God, that's always a big thing. Always when we're dealing with it, it's like, if we tell so and so, then what? But they might say, and then how do you do this? And it's like, yeah. So there's never, I think it's always tricky, isn't it? Whether you go first with a big communication, and then people start to get like pulled into rooms, so before already it's happening, and so I think it depends on how many people are affected. But I always say to our clients when we're doing this, whichever way you do it in terms of who you're telling when, how, always make sure once that initial bit is done in the meetings, you communicate then out, you control that narrative. People decide and make their own judgment on what's happening and why, but put something out there, talk to your people. And ideally, if you could talk to your people face to face, do it that way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's obviously it's a little bit harder now with remote work and things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things move very quickly, but the human part, the human element of this, it has the good and the bad. That you are a little bit detached because you are looking through a screen. So I think the coming and going of people, I don't know, it's a really there's a lot of give and take in this sort of like remote work environment that you lose certain things, but I think it's really a cultural thing too. Like you got to find the people that fit that type of culture and want to work that way, and it's complicated. This was super interesting. I learned a lot about how to do this. Fortunately, I don't have a large enough tech company to have to be doing redundancy reductions like this. But I don't envy. I mean, I know people that have done it. I have good friends that have done it in their companies, and it's always sleepless nights. It's always nobody likes doing this, no matter what. So
they don't. I think that's another really important thing to note, that nobody enjoys the process. So I think as much as we can, make the process, as I don't think the word's pleasant. So, follow a process and do it well and communicate well and remember our people are human. Also remember that it's just not nice. So people aren't going to thank you. So, thank you for running that process really well for me. And they're unlikely to do that, but they'll also, on reflection after a while, feel better that you did, run it really. And also remember, in this day and age, we're living like where people can, share so much information, through multiple ways, that if people are leaving your business, you want them to go out and say, do you know what, it sucks that I got made redundant, but do you know what, they handled it really well and they treated me really well, so actually they are a good place to work, rather than, oh, do you know what, they made me redundant and they were they're real idiots about it as well. So it's always worthwhile, I think, looking after your people as they leave your business just as much as people who are coming into it.
I mean, in any process, like the more empirical you can be too, and the more scientific you can be about things. I mean, these are like people issues, and it's obviously need to be people driven. But I think the more you can say, hey, this is why this was laid out, this is why it was done.
Yeah.
There's less that you can debate. Like the more room you can take out of debate, the better.
Absolutely. And, businesses will have to make tough decisions. And I think that's okay. And people understand that. But I think it's more about kind of like, we spoke about throughout today. It's about sort of explaining that and not sort of hiding from it, or not even, communicating, saying, do you know what, we're having a really tough time right now as a business. These are the reasons why. And this is what we're trying to do to get through it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the more people can know about the overall health of the business, KPIs, how things are going across things. I frankly, I fail at this a lot of times because I get so focused on, you think because you're sitting with your sales and marketing team that everyone else knows what's going on, and you forget no, I need to communicate this to people, because then you're sitting with the product team, and the product team knows what's going on and what's coming out, but the sales and marketing team doesn't know what's coming out. And it's such a critical thing. Even people think we have a smallish company, and it's still really hard. It's like one of the hardest things is over communicating things, and especially in remote work, because people don't cross each other in the hallways, they don't see things, and it's a critical piece of everything. I'm trying to get better at it every day.
Yeah, and I think that, and what I always say to my clients is, like, don't underestimate how much time and effort managing people takes. Like, we see so often that people get promoted to be a people manager because they're really good at their job, but just because you're good at, being a software developer or marketing exec, whatever it is, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be a great people manager. And also, let's remember that is a job in itself. So let's give our managers the support and the training and the tools they need and the time to be able to do this, because I'm sure in your experience you've had like some pretty bad managers, well, hopefully you haven't, but if you have, the impact that has. So
I've been one of those bad managers, so I have experience.
Same, because it takes time and effort and a certain skill set to do it. So, and it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants people to be a people manager, and that's okay. But let's also remember it is a job in itself, so it's hard.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's funny because I read that a lot and I hear it a lot, and yet it's still it still gets, you can read this in like hundreds of books. It's like people management is just an imperfect science that, some people can do, some people can, and because you're a good developer doesn't mean you're gonna be a good manager. In fact, it usually means the opposite
Yeah.
of what like if you're good at something, you're not gonna be good at this. But it's incredible because it's been written a lot of times, and it's just one of those things that I think it's really such a soft science that people like it's really
Yeah.
random. It's something that people haven't been
Yeah.
able to figure out because there is no 100% quantifiable way other than just processes. Like, okay, we have OKRs or similar
Yeah.
things, and we follow them, and this person's good at following up on it, and it's like 100% communication based. I was with a friend of mine the other day. It's a CEO of his company. He said he considers chief CEO to be chief, or no, he's the chief repeating officer, because he says, I just repeat the same things over and over again every day. And he's like, I feel like I'm being mean that I'm repeating it. I feel like I'm treating people like they're idiots, but they're not. He's like, when people finally think it's really annoying, that means you've repeated it enough. But he's like, you can't repeat things enough.
No.
And he's right. And I mean, I guess the art of it is figuring out ways to say the same thing in different ways so people are always surprised and listening to it. But it's a tough art. It's really hard. I don't envy anyone, especially when you're in the position of having to take on redundancies. It adds another complexity to it.
Yeah, it's definitely not my favorite part of the job, but it's obviously something that has to be done. So if it has to be done, then for me, it's about making sure that you're doing it, properly. And so, yeah.
For sure.
Thank you, Kelly. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, Andrew. It really has. And I hope everyone has been able to take something from it. We will be sending out the recording to anybody who signed up, wasn't able to make it today. But if there's any questions, then feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll wait here and see if we get any questions.
That's right. I forgot to mention that earlier, that if people wanted to ask questions, we can field them in here.
Okay, give a couple of minutes.
This is always the hardest part of webinars, is the prompt of telling people to ask questions, and then the delay. You always hope that people, like, a question came up during the discussion.
I know,
like, oh,
right?
That was interesting. I want to hear more about that, or I have a question about that. But yeah, this is always the uncomfortable part of having to wait and see what comes
I was
out.
trying to see the positives. So if I don't ask any questions, hopefully it's because we just answered everything during the webinar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, I don't know if this is, in this case, people can be anonymous in their questions as well. I find sometimes people, when they can be anonymous, they feel more comfortable asking the questions. Then we have to be the people that ask the difficult questions, especially for this type of topic. I mean, I don't know. You want to be anonymous because you also don't want people to think that maybe you're considering this type of move, or that you're in the process of doing this.
Yeah, definitely tricky situation. Okay.
Oh, looks like there are no questions.
Yeah, it looks like we're all good. Okay, well, thank you again, Andrew. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. It's been a pleasure. And we will be sharing the recording. But if anyone wants to reach out after the webinar, then I can be found at hr-star, that's .co.uk, or on Kelly Tucker on LinkedIn. Andrew, yourself?
You can find me at lanteria.com and send us questions. Like Kelly said, there's a lot of things around documentation and process, and our product is perfect for that. So just to give a plug to ourselves, if you want to follow a process, the best thing to do is start today inputting all this information into an HR management system. So when you do run into redundancies, you have all those systems in place and all that data already set up.
Absolutely. And if we're talking about a scoring situation, then we'll need data to back up those scores. So yeah, we need to be storing that stuff from day one. So that is a really good point. Yeah,
just a quick plug for us.
No problem. Brilliant.
Thanks, Kelly.
Well, thank you so much. Been a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.